As I've been going through my journey of taking a critical view of creepypastas that I remember from when I was a kid, I've had many stories recommended to me. Most of these have been stories that have a reputation for being pretty poor quality. I've been asked to look at Jane the Killer and My Immortal and many other ones. But there have been a number of comments that have asked me to take a look at what seems to be regarded as one of the best creepypastas, Abandoned by Disney. Now, I read Abandoned by Disney for the first time like 15 years ago when I was in middle school, and I remember thinking that it was pretty creepy at the time. But I also thought that Jeff the Killer was peak fiction back then, so that literally tells us nothing about the quality of the story. And I have to say that I was surprised that it kept being mentioned as one of the best creepypastas, because my mind just kind of associates it with the other popular stories of the time. And if this series has taught us anything, it's that most of those old stories have kind of a questionable level of quality. So I'm actually very curious to revisit this story and see how well it all holds up when compared to other internet horror stories, and maybe how it compares to just horror literature in general. I'm going to be going in pretty much blind to this story, so what you'll be seeing are my thoughts as I read the story that I just barely remember. And I'll just be critiquing the story as I go and then talking about whether it lives up to the hype. A couple disclaimers before we start. One, I'm kind of a little bit of a Disney adult. If you feel the need to click off the video now, then I completely understand. I guess I'm like barely a Disney adult. I haven't been to one of the theme parks in years, but I plan on going there in the near future, and I still love me some classic Disney movies. But my personal intimate knowledge when it comes to Disney has to do with their theme parks in particular. I know an embarrassing amount of Disney theme park trivia. Fun fact, my uncle was actually the lead engineer behind the Star Wars Rise of the Resistance ride, so I've got a familial connection to Disney engineering. And I've also watched an insane amount of Defunct Land and Yesterworld, so I'm going to be pretty interested to see how this story deals with the idea of a fake Disney resort. I'll try not to be too obnoxious as we go along, but I'm also me, so I'll probably be pretty obnoxious. I'm mostly just curious as to how much the author did their homework before writing this story. Like always, the point of this video is to critique the story and talk about what it does well and what it doesn't do so well, and I'm not here to tell you you can't enjoy a story. And I'm also not here to tell you that you have to enjoy something that I personally like. I just think that looking at these stories with a more critical lens is a fun exercise in discussing fiction. Last thing, my friend and I started a Let's Play channel that I'll link in the description of this video where we're playing Cassette Beasts. Please go subscribe to us over there. We'd love to hit 500 subs by the end of July. But enough yapping, let's see if Abandoned by Disney really is that good. Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real, live ghost town. Thanks to the Galactic Star Cruiser, Disney is now responsible for 2 ghost towns. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. This is actually true, although it's most likely the case that it never truly opened to the public. It's actually kind of impressive how little information there is about this place. We know that Disney attempted to make a resort in Baker's Bay, but they needed to dredge the bay in order for the cruise ships to dock there, and they just couldn't properly dredge it. There were structures that were built there and then just completely abandoned, but it doesn't seem like any cruise ships ever stopped there. Later, Disney would buy a private island and actually make a resort there for the cruise ships to stop on. And I guess it is worth noting that there are actually 2 abandoned Disney properties in Florida. Those being Discovery Island, a wildlife resort that was replaced by Animal Kingdom, and River Country, which is a water park that closed in the early 2000s that was just barely demolished a couple years ago. It's not entirely certain why River Country closed. People have speculated there was like brain-eating amoebas in the water, which, given it was made in Florida, there's a decent chance that's true, but it was almost certainly just for financial reasons. And if you're wondering why Disney would just leave these things there instead of demolishing them, it's because they owned so much land in Florida, they don't really need to demolish a lot of things. So instead of paying to tear these things down, they just let them collect dust until they really need the land for whatever reason. That's just some fun facts for you guys. I do find it funny that the author tells us that Treasure Island was this like completed resort and that they would drop people off, and they're very emphatic about it being a fact, when it just isn't true. But I suspect that this serves to let the reader know that we've entered into a sort of alternate reality where the main focus of this story, Mowgli's Palace, was actually built. Disney blew $30 million on a place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. What's even more insane is that this is just complete chump change when it comes to Disney now. The Galactic Star Cruiser, which was the failed Star Wars hotel, cost $1 billion to build, and now it's just closed. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, They were too lazy to work a regular schedule. I didn't expect this story to open with the good people of the Bahamas catching strays, but it also wouldn't surprise me if this was actually something that Disney executives said back then. That's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and obviously it wasn't because of foreigners or lazy. Both are convenient excuses. I honestly wouldn't blame Disney for shutting this all down due to the sand because it's coarse and rough and irritating and it gets everywhere. No, I sincerely doubt those reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's palace. I have to say that so far, I'm really liking this story. I think that the tone that the author is using here is really expressive and interesting. It's smug in a way that feels like expressive, like I said. I have criticized other creepypastas in the past for not having a consistent tone all the way through, and I think that if this story can hold on to this kind of like conspiracy theorist vibe, then it'll be great. Also, I feel the need to point out that Mowgli's palace is not a real place. A lot of people seem to think it is, but that's just a testament to how convincing this story can be at times. I personally really love stories that are super convincing when it comes to supposed real events. I talked about this in my video on the short story collection Found. If a story can make me go Google and double check the existence of something that I should for sure know about whether it existed or not, that's a good sign. I suspect that most people reading this story will be convinced of Mowgli's palace's existence because, presumably, most readers will have more of a life than I do. Near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's palace in the late 1980s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. I again just have to shout out how expressive this narration feels. It feels like I'm talking to a conspiracy theorist who is just completely convinced that what they're telling me is true. It's good stuff. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might better remember the story The Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd know it as a Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened/pursued by other animals. Mowgli's palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for the project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but this feels like a nod to the Florida Project or Project Florida, which is when Disney created dozens of like shell companies to buy a bunch of land in Florida. Disneyland had already been created at that point, and they wanted to make a second theme park in Florida, so they started just buying up a bunch of what was then kind of like swampland. It was super cheap for that reason, but the issue was that if the landowners realized that it was Disney buying the land in Florida, they would raise their prices considerably. Hence why Disney created all these fake companies to like buy a bunch of lands from supposedly like small business owners. It's kind of a very shady thing to do. And eventually it did leak to the press that Disney was buying land out there and the prices did shoot up, but the project served its purpose given the amount of land that Disney has there now. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. Okay, so something that I have noticed in this story so far is that there's some weird capitalization going on. Notably, government being capitalized is a little strange. There was also the capitalization of jungle themed in the paragraph before, which again feels out of place. It's not really that big of a deal. I'm just obnoxious about that kind of stuff. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. I'll have to do some more research on this, but the government seizing land to then go on to sell it to Disney is absolutely insane. I doubt that could happen, but it's still wild, and honestly, it probably has happened in the past before. Then there was the concept art. A bunch of stuffed shirts from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. It's kind of hilarious that Disney would do this like clandestine operation to get the government to condemn recently constructed homes, only to turn around and try to pander to the community. I can imagine them being like, listen, I know that you guys all just lost your childhood homes, but think about how cool our new themed hotel is going to be. It reminds me of the I Think You Should Leave sketch where the hot dog car crashes into the building and then a guy in a hot dog costume shows up and is like, we're all still trying to figure out who did this. When they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear, well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their crap. Now, I know that Disney is known for committing to their theming. It's what makes their theme parks so appealing to a lot of people because pretty much everything is themed in one way or another. But to think that Disney was planning on having their staff walk around in loincloths and presumably nothing else except maybe a pair of mouse ears is hilarious. I don't know if this counts as a point against the story or not. I don't really think it does since we're kind of in an alternate universe, but it does stretch credulity just a little bit. I think with any story based in some sort of reality, you have to establish pretty early on how realistic the story is going to be, and I don't know if the story has really done that yet. On one hand, you do have the deep cut about Treasure Island, and the story does seem like it's trying to present itself as real, but some of these details definitely feel off now. Again, it's not necessarily a flaw with the story so far, it's just an interesting decision to make for a story that focuses on a fictional facility made by a real company. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle, and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area of the southern USA. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. So we're seeing a couple more cracks in the writing itself here. Wealth should say wealthy, and jungle and loincloths are also unnecessarily capitalized. I will say that I'm reading the story on the website Nightscribe, so some of the errors could just be from the person who transcribed this for this particular website. And as with pretty much every creepypasta, they're supposed to be real accounts, so you can excuse some of the grammar and writing issues as being technically realistic. But I promise I won't spend the entire story complaining about grammar. I'm just fresh off the heels of finishing reading a novel, so it's sticking out to me a lot more than usual. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. It's kind of funny to me that we're all aware of Disney absolutely housing this land from the locals, but the way that it's written makes it seem like they're more mad about the Indian palace and loincloths. Also, snapping a poster board over your knee is such a funny symbol of protest. I bet the person that did that thought he was just the coolest guy ever. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. That's the most metal sentence I have read in one of these stories yet. Disney is like the Bane from the Dark Knight Rises of community housing disputes. The houses were razed and the land was cleared, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. This isn't surprising at all. Donald Duck is a notorious gaslighter. So anyways, Treasure Island at the Bahamas, Disney sunk those millions and then split. The same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete, visitors actually stayed at the resort, the surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. I love the mental image this gives me of like a bunch of tourists walking around completely lost and confused and just completely pissed about it the entire time. I just imagine someone being like, can anyone tell me where the frickin' Mowgli's Palace is? Yeah, I think it's in that giant man-made jungle with a large palace poking out of the tree line. But also that is kind of realistic because I personally live in like kind of a touristy area of the Washington coast, and the other week I ran into a lady who was just like absolutely pissed that more things weren't open. It was like 8 p.m. on a Tuesday and she was trying to go to a restaurant and she said that all of them are closed. They weren't all closed, but a lot of them do close because like everything here is locally owned and people have to like live their lives on top of working at their business. So I actually get what they mean by irate tourists because I have seen a few of them and I've only lived here for like a year. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down and nobody knew what the heck to think, but they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. This story is pretty fascinating to read following the failure of the Star Wars Hotel. It might have seemed kind of unrealistic that Disney would have abandoned this large resort beforehand, but we know now that Disney is seemingly fine with spending $1 billion on a hotel and then completely shutting it down when it doesn't perform up to standards. In that way, the story has maybe aged a little poorly by no fault of its own. I'm sure that the abandonment of Mowgli's Palace is supposed to be out of place, but now it just kind of feels like a standard move from Disney. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I live maybe 4 hours away from Emerald Isle, so I really only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy stuff he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. I would actually suggest totally looking at some of those old pictures of the abandoned Treasure Island Resort. It's pretty interesting, a little spooky, and it's a good thing to base a creepypasta on. Heck, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there felt just as angry about Treasure Island as folks did here about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local water when they closed, including sharks. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? This story is giving me major David Lubar vibes, which is a huge compliment. If you don't know who he is, he wrote a series of short horror story collections for kids. The first one that I read by him was Invasion of the Road Weenies, and all of the books in that series incorporate weenies into the title. I have a couple videos on those books. The voice that our author is using here sounds very similar to how Lubar would write a lot of his protagonists, and I think that's pretty cool. You should also read those books if you haven't yet. They're awesome. Well, what I'm getting at is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years had passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. So this is our setup, and I think it's done really, really well. The history lesson at the beginning gives us context for this fictional location and builds animosity towards Disney and Mowgli's palace. It feels like it's almost going for a similar vibe to Ted the Caver, which is another exploration blog, but this time we're taking a look at an abandoned resort instead of a cave. By the way, I will cover Ted the Caver in the future. I need to reread all of it, but I remember really loving it, and I read it all a couple months ago, and it's still awesome. I'm not going to say that I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly, it took me another year after I found that Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place. That had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they all had swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there lauding their embarrassment, you know? I do wonder how this supposed lack of information regarding Mowgli's palace fits in with all of the information that our narrator had before going there. It feels like the author is trying to give a reasonable explanation as to why the reader would have never heard of this place, but that doesn't quite track with what we've heard before in the story. For what it's worth, I think that having there already be information online about Mowgli's palace would have totally worked fine here. I was already on board with the setup. Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results, basically for no good reason. If only our narrator could have looked into the future where the first 10 results you get on every Google search are either paid ads or AI answers, making the site more useless than ever. Looking back, it's probably not that nobody spoke at the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old map I'd received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotion item sent out to people who had recently been to Disney World, and I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it, it just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it a few months into my research, and even then it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where would I find Mowgli's?" I do like this very Blair Witch Project vibe we have going on here with some of the strange locals and our narrator asking questions about this mysterious local legend. I think it's really tempting to skip all of this atmospheric setup work in an internet horror story, but all of this stuff really does serve a useful purpose of setting the tone and the feel of the story. The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of growth. Tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous monolithic wooden gates whose supports to either side looked like they must have been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Something that is easy to take for granted in this story is just how effectively our author describes what the narrator is seeing. So many creepypastas miss out on this entirely. A lesser story would simply say, "There was a large gate that gave me an ominous feeling," and that would still technically tell the reader the information that they need to know, but it would be far less effective. I think detailed descriptions have a place in every story, and it's much better to over-describe something than it is to under-describe something, especially when it comes to horror. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in black, "Abandoned by Disney." Clearly the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not drive, so grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set off on foot. Maybe just like one comma too many there. It might have been better if the author broke that sentence up into two. It's easy to get lost in there the way that it's written. Maybe the gates were open enough to walk through but not drive, so I grabbed my digital camera and map of the resort and set off on foot would flow just a little bit better. The inner grounds of the palace were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood in their own stinking bug-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. This is a more good descriptive writing. It fits in well with what we've already learned about Disney's history with the local town here and the abandonment of the property. This was a resort that was placed somewhere where it wasn't wanted by the locals, and that is being reflected in the clash of the nature of the area itself, because it's out of place down to its core. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotting wood and various charred bits of unidentified identifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of assorted debris chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, who stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. I can't believe this. For once in a creepypasta, a story has said the most whatever thing about the situation, and it's actually the most whatever thing about it. In my last creepypasta video, I complained that creepypastas will often say like the scariest thing about the situation and then describe something that is very clearly not the scariest thing about that situation. But this ancient statue of Baloo is for sure the most interesting thing that our narrator is seeing, so that phrasing actually works this time around. There's a first time for everything, I guess. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring into empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird poop covered whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. It's funny that it mentions the doors being gone because I remember when I was growing up, there was this really rich neighborhood near mine called First Place. And one of the entrances to the neighborhood had this like big circular planter box kind of thing that made like a roundabout for the cars to drive around. And then it had the words First Place bolted onto the concrete. And they were all just individual gold letters bolted on there that spelled First Place. I don't know if I ever saw that planter box with all of its letters after like the first 2 months of it going up. People just kept coming by and stealing them, and then they would get replaced and then stolen again. So I fully believe that people stole the fancy doors off of Mowgli's palace. People are also just kind of crazy about stealing old Disney memorabilia. Jenny Nicholson has a really great video about someone trying to steal a Disney animatronic that you should really watch. Above the front doors, or the gaping maw where they had been, someone had once again painted "Abandoned by Disney." I don't know if the author is intentionally trying to evoke the "abandon all hope, ye who enter here" line, but it's definitely working for me. I wish I could tell you about all the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people had stolen the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, giant fake trees, they were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified my every step like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you'd imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances in space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. I don't know if it's just the way that things have been described up to this point, but the phrasing "very old piss" kind of came out of nowhere and made me laugh. Fair play to the author there. Something that I like about the way the author has been describing the palace is that they have hit multiple of the 5 senses already, which is something that's really easy to overlook. We've been told what the narrator is seeing, we've been told that the place is open and he can hear his footsteps echoing, and we now know that it smells like very old piss. A lot of amateur authors will really only focus on visual descriptions rather than taking the time to describe the other senses, and I think that makes a story much weaker overall. Because whenever we actually experience something, we are taking in much more information than simply what we see, so it's good to emulate that experience in your writing like this story does. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat, and as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. I've got to say that I feel a little called out because the narrator just described the freezer in the way that I am often described by a lot of people. Not even remotely cool. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movements were so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it in my fist, then carefully letting go. But within seconds, it started to swing once more. We love a good mini mystery at the beginning of a scary story. These little tiny details like the mysterious swinging hook serve to keep the reader engaged before getting to the main focus of the story. And I've said it a lot before, but a good scary story has to be engaging the entire way through. If you have a story that is really uninteresting with a completely masterful scare at the end, you have a bad story. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of the place. Just like the Treasure Island Resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about a ½ inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay there very long. It's funny, I'm pretty sure there was like a Five Nights at Freddy's fan game that was based off of this story, and it's pretty crazy how well this story lends itself to that style of game. Also, the only reason that I think there's a Five Nights at Freddy's fan game is because I've watched like the Sagan Hawks retrospective of Five Nights at Freddy's, and he talks about a lot of fan games. So I'm fairly certain there's one based off the story called Five Nights at Treasure Island, but I've never played it. And it's ironic that a story like this, one that was almost certainly just trying to be an entertaining horror story, got a cool fan game made of it when it wasn't really fishing for it. I had a lot of people wave away some of the criticisms I made of sonic.exe by saying that the author had to write it the way he did because he wanted someone to make a fan game of it. But we're seeing here that sometimes just writing a creepy story with good descriptions is enough material for a game rather than like referencing specific sounds and assets from other games. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks and the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I went there, all dripped, leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut off the water long ago. It's kind of funny that the author thinks that we might think he's like kind of strange or especially daring to go into the women's bathroom when he's already breaking into an abandoned resort. Also, do women's restrooms in the US typically have bidets in them? We certainly don't have those in the men's restrooms, and it would probably be even less likely they were in there back in the 80s when this was built. There were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to look through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out. Small writing critique here, it would probably have been better phrased as like, I really thought I heard a quiet conversation coming from inside the room, or coming from the other side of the door, I heard a quiet conversation. The way it's phrased currently isn't technically incorrect at all, I just think it sounds a little clunky, but that's just my opinion, so maybe it sounds totally fine to you guys. Though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on my mind, this is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. Short unknown reply. I didn't know that. Your father told you. Unknown reply, or possibly just weeping. It's a little strange to say that this was probably just your own breathing echoing or the sound of water when you were able to discern this much of the conversation. Like, I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's a pretty good amount of dialogue to pick up on when you can just barely hear what might not be an actual conversation. From what I remember about this story, which again, it's been like years since I've read this, I have no idea where this all fits into later, but I like the new mystery introduced here. It's pretty eerie. I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed up there and probably would have knifed me. Weirdly specific and brutal coming from a narrator here, but that's okay. I guess anything can happen, so he's not incorrect for being worried about this particular scenario. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted the trip up. As I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I had apparently missed. Something that would give me at least one thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on the pedestal right near the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell onto the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer again to get the detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned, and slithered off the pedestal across the grass and into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. I assume that we're going to get an explanation as to what this snake really was, because the longest python ever recorded was 33 feet long, and this one was 80 feet long. And from my research, that is also the longest snake ever recorded, so I'm guessing the snake is some sort of like genetically altered monstrosity that Goofy cooked up one day. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the ground. Right there on my floor plan map was the Reptile House. I should have known. I read about the sharks at Treasure Island, and I should have known they'd done this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back towards the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances and backed my way into the building. I took a few deep breaths and slaps to my own face to get myself right in the head again after that. I do appreciate how freaked out our narrator is at this like giant snake, because I would be feeling the exact same way, and I'm not even that particularly scared of snakes in general. It's nice for the protagonist in a horror story to not do something stupid like chase after the snake or continue exploring the reptile house. It feels more believable that he'd just like dip after that. I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet, or haul myself onto a desk of questionable reliability. I had seen some stairs near the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the "Abandoned by Disney" motto I'd become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep at least somewhat clean. Pay attention, you aspiring creepypasta authors. This author is doing a really good job of explaining why the narrator is going to end up finding the next location he'll visit to move the plot along. It's refreshing to have this natural flow of story beats in a way that feels completely believable. Our narrator hasn't made a single decision yet that feels contrived or out of place. The snake scene serves to give the reader a little bit of a scare while also bringing the narrator back to the steps where the rest of the story will continue on from. It's just good writing. The stairway led down, below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see that the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, said, "Mascots only, thank you." I can't remember if this is a criticism that I've heard before or if this is an original thought, but it's highly unlikely Disney would label a door this way in one of their resorts. Their employees are pretty much all referred to as cast members, and the costume mascots are typically referred to as face characters or fur characters. The face characters are like the princesses that show their actual faces, whereas the fur characters are any costumes that cover the cast members' faces like Mickey Mouse. At least those were the terms they used when my wife worked at Disney World. It's really not that big of a deal for the story, but it's just a small little inconsistency that I noticed. This perked up my spirits a little bit for two reasons. One, a mascot-only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. I'll forgive some of the awkward formatting in this most recent paragraph because it's always kind of awkward to write that kind of like verbal list formatting. But again, I think the story is doing a really good job of keeping things interesting and giving us a reason as to why our narrator would keep exploring this spooky abandoned resort. This was the one place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of, or hadn't been able to do at the time. I think that nobody else had apparently thought of is technically correct, but it sounds a little odd to me. It feels like it should be something nobody else had thought of, apparently. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcome change from the rest of the building I'd seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads and pens, there were clocks, even a punching clock on the wall complete with filled out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static-filled television and long rotted out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalypse movies where everything is left in the state of evacuation. Okay, this is maybe a little bit too on the nose for me. I think the audience would have been able to gather that things were abandoned suddenly by the way they've been presented so far. It feels maybe just a little bit heavy-handed to just tell us that things looked like they do in a post-apocalyptic movie. I don't think we needed that clarification. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascots only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered and almost melded with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real rotting crimson floor covering. I'm not going to keep harping on it, but I do feel like the quality of writing is starting to suffer just a little bit. I'm seeing more and more mistakes as we read further into the story. Everything was just sort of squishy. Anything wood disintegrated into mush when I applied even the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging on the hooks in one of the rooms simply fell to moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was that the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dank, suffocating depths of the place. I'm honestly kind of shocked that any of the lights are even working at all. Is this resort still hooked up to the power grid, or does it have its own generator that's still functioning? Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where the costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping sound and the door creaked open slowly. At the time of recording this video, I'm currently reading Hell House by Richard Matheson, which is about a spooky haunted house, so I love these like creepy door opening vibes. I think there's something weirdly scary about a door opening on its own, especially if the door was locked when you just tried it. It's both perfectly spooky and also like tempting enough that you'd have to check it out. Our bedroom door doesn't latch properly and it will open itself at night if we have the window open in our room, and it has scared me to death on quite a few occasions. That's right, you heard me, I've been scared to death multiple times. I'm like a quadruple ghost at this point. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was just going to keep getting brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it would reach that critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. This narrator is far braver than I am. I would have been out of there so fast after the snake, and if I did make my way down to where he's at, I would have left when the lights turned on. Even if nothing paranormal is happening here, the fact that I am in an abandoned resort with presumably another person who turned on the lights is terrifying enough. Even more terrifying is that this 80-foot snake is maybe like an electrician who is messing and repairing the electrical circuits as I'm down there. The room is exactly as I had pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on the hangers towards the back. I still can't get over the fact that this resort had its employees walking around in loincloths. I can't imagine Disney being cool with most of their staff walking around pretty much naked. What I found odd, and what I wanted to photograph right away, was a Mickey Mouse costume at the center of the room. Unlike other costumes, it was lying on its back in the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse, black where he should be white and white where he should be black. His normally red overalls were light blue. Okay, so this is the part of the story that I remember the most, and this is the part of the story that I have the hardest time with. I was hoping that by rereading it, I would maybe change my opinion of it. I'm on board with there being a creepy old Mickey Mouse costume that does some creepy stuff. It's just the photo negative aspect of it that doesn't really work for me. It's just too outwardly creepy to feel believable. I think that the story has done a super good job of setting up a creepy atmosphere in a very realistic setting. So introducing this scary Mickey Mouse costume that Disney apparently commissioned takes me out of the story just a little bit. I get that they wanted an iconic character for their story, but I think that just having an old worn down Mickey Mouse costume would have worked a lot better and felt a lot more believable and in line with what we've read so far. But I know that a lot of people probably don't feel this way at all about the negative Mickey Mouse suit, so maybe it's not that big of a deal. It's just my opinion. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. Off-putting almost directly into put off is kind of funny to me. It's like the most correct way you could possibly write that sentence and use that particular combination of words, but it still just feels out of place to me. I don't know if I've ever read something like that before. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the walls. Upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, some with plastic eyes missing. Okay, is the author doing the sonic.exe thing now? It seems like there should be pictures that go with this story, given that we were being told of like the specific angles of the pictures that he took. If there are pictures that go with this story, I just personally haven't seen them. They weren't in the article that I read on Nightscribe, which again is like the first link that shows up when you search Abandoned by Disney. Then I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the bedraggled character heads on the slick, grimy floor. Shout out to the story for using a word that I don't think I've ever heard before, or at least I didn't recognize. Bedraggled is a new one for me, and I'll start using that way more from now on. It's an awesome word. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained, staring up at me. Okay, there are seriously a lot of Five Nights at Freddy's parallels in this story. I wonder if the creator of those games had read this before, because it's kind of strange how similar they are in a lot of ways. Like, not only do we have spooky mascot costumes, we also have dead bodies being found inside those spooky mascot costumes. That can't be a coincidence. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know? I had to. For any of number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. What an oddly brutal way to phrase that. Like, I know that taking a picture of a human skull in an abandoned resort might sound weird, but if you actually engage your stupid brain, then you'll see that it isn't. For what it's worth, I actually think this fits in with the tone of the narrator that has been set up from the beginning of the story. He has a very kind of like aggressive way of speaking, and it's really fun to read. I need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start, that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, that photo-negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. Okay, the story is losing me just a little bit now. I think I'm supposed to be scared, but I'm definitely not scared at all. But I'm hoping it can deliver on some good scares soon. Also, this isn't me just being like, I'm so tough I don't get scared by anything. I get scared by a lot of things very easily. It's one of the reasons I love horror so much. First, sitting up, then climbing to its feet, the Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there at the center of the room, its fake face just staring directly at me as I mumbled no over and over and over. I do love that the narrator says that the costume got up and then concedes that it would be better to say that the person inside the costume got up. That's the more likely option here. I know that we're reading a creepypasta, so it very well could just be a haunted costume, but I don't know if jumping right to the paranormal would be warranted at this stage in the story. With shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature, now quietly sizing me up. Calling this thing the opposite creature is kind of an odd choice. I think I'd prefer if they just called it like the mascot costume. Once again, we've jumped to creature territory where there could just be a guy in there. The digital camera's screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. Disney's got that North Korean anti-surveillance technology. Impressive. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. I'm very curious to know if this costume is like a regular Mickey Mouse-sized costume, because Mickey is pretty short, and that kind of makes the situation a little bit funny to me. Don't get me wrong, this would still be very freaky if you weren't in this situation, but the way that I'm picturing it isn't exactly filling me with dread. But also, what an awesome detail to include in your Five Nights at Freddy's fan game of like, you only see the dead pixels through the camera. That would be a really interesting thing to incorporate into a game. This is just like proto Five Nights at Freddy's. Then the camera died, went blank and quiet and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. Okay, so one of the things that I remember from this story and that Jenny Nicholson points out in her video that I was curious about is the issue of Mickey Mouse's voice. She talks about how whenever someone is reading this story, they have to decide whether they're going to really go for it with the Mickey Mouse voice or not. The issue, of course, is that Mickey Mouse's voice is so far away from even being remotely scary that it kills any of the horror that has been built up to this point. And I was kind of stressing out about this exact moment in the story because I didn't know what I was going to do when I read it. Because on one hand, it is a Mickey Mouse costume, so of course my mind goes right to Mickey Mouse's voice, but also, that voice isn't scary in the slightest. And I had to assume that the author wouldn't have intended us to picture that squeaky voice and instead wanted us to hear something far creepier and more sinister. So I think it would be unfair to just go straight for the Mickey Mouse voice when I read this, because that would obviously make this climactic moment funny rather than scary. And if I'm going to do a good faith reading of this story and not just try to clown on it, then I owe the author the benefit of the doubt. I don't want this video to be me doing an uncharitable reading of this story, especially since it seems highly regarded in the creepypasta community. So you can imagine that over the few days that it took me to write this script, I was kind of getting a little anxious and going back and forth on the voice. Luckily, I didn't have to end up making that choice in the end, and here's why. Hey, it said in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. So the author did fully intend us to read this in Mickey Mouse's voice. They called it perverted, which is maybe a weird adjective to use given what that word usually refers to, but then they call it perfectly executed. So my issue now isn't that I have to decide between reading this as Mickey Mouse or doing some sort of creepy creature voice. My issue is that I can't do a perfectly executed Mickey Mouse impression, but whatever, here goes. Wanna see my head come off? It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. Kind of weird to specify a wounded man and not just say like a wounded animal, because I don't usually associate man with being anyone's prey, but it's not that big of a deal, I'm just being annoying again. As it worked its digits into its neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky yellow blood. Photonegative Mickey needs to get his humors rebalanced if he's got that much yellow bile inside of him. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh, only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. Abandoned by God. I don't know if this is just a me thing, but I roll my eyes every time one of these internet horror stories tries to use the word God to be spooky. It just doesn't do it for me. Sonic.exe did the same thing where Evil Sonic said, "I am God," and it just comes off as funny to me, but that's neither here nor there. Let's finish out the rest of the story. I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, fled for my sanity, if not my very life, I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out. End of story. So that was Abandoned by Disney. Let me go over all the things about this story that I liked. I really liked all of the setup, and I thought that the story about Treasure Island was a good way to start off the story. I really loved all of the descriptions of Mowgli's palace. I loved how the story flowed pretty naturally with our narrator being taken from location to location in a realistic way. I loved how much personality there was in the writing style that the narrator uses. Some of these stories can be pretty bland in terms of protagonist, but this wasn't like that at all. I think the core concept of exploring an abandoned Disney location is a really neat idea, and I love how it seems like a lot of mascot horror took inspiration from this story. And I should also say that this is also like way better than like most mascot horror that comes out today, so again, huge props to the writer. There was a lot here to love, and I commend the author for elevating the story beyond what most creepypastas were doing at the time. It's written very competently. Now let me talk about what I don't like in this story. For me, unfortunately, the biggest thing that doesn't work for me is the entire ending sequence to the story, as well as most of the horror. For how well the author described everything up until that point, they really dropped the ball for the big final horror set piece. All we get is the description of some thick, chunky yellow blood. And I know that horror is incredibly subjective, and that things that scare me might not scare you, and that things that you find terrifying might not scare me at all, but this story just isn't that scary to me. And I think so much of that, unfortunately, hinges on the Mickey Mouse voice. It brings the reader to a place that borders on comedy right before the final big scare. And a lot of you guys might be like frustrated with me for putting so much weight onto the Mickey Mouse voice, because you're like, if you're reading the story, it really doesn't matter. But as somebody who like hears everything that I read, I like when I'm reading my head, I can picture the voice in my head of whoever's speaking. That gets to me really bad. And then also when I make videos for the channel, I have to read the entire story. So these are decisions that I actually have to think of when it comes to reading a story to you guys. And that voice just makes the final scare so much less impactful for me. And I think a lot of other readers would feel the same. I think the author should have just like specified that it was not really a Mickey Mouse voice, or it was raspy and creepy, or just something a little bit more scary. They could also just not have Mickey Mouse say anything before he starts to tear his own head off. I think that would have worked fine as well. I really think they just shot themselves in the foot when they wrote a perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice, because that leaves the reader like no room to imagine what the voice might sound like, because we know what Mickey Mouse sounds like. What confuses me the most about this story is why it's often regarded as the best creepypasta. I don't really understand that. I think this is a lot better than something like sonic.exe or Jeff the Killer, and I'd put this above the Russian sleep experiment, but that's not saying like a whole ton, honestly. This is a perfectly competent creepypasta, and I think the ideas that it presents are really good and really unique. And again, I commend the author so much on that. They're obviously a very imaginative person, but I don't think it goes that much further in terms of quality than like competent, at least to me. I do believe that there are more parts to this story, like this was the original and then the author wrote like more chapters to it. So maybe that's where it gets really good. And I should also say that the line between a creepypasta and a no sleep story has always been a little arbitrary and kind of dumb to me. I consider all of like no sleep just creepypastas. So if we're going to compare the story to something like Pen Pal, which is what I consider to be one of the best creepypastas, if not the best creepypasta, then Pen Pal is going to blow this out of the water. But I don't want to just sit here and talk about why this story doesn't work. I want to give my idea of what a rewrite could look like and what would make me personally more scared of the story. First up, I think that pretty much the entire story, up until the photo negative Mickey Mouse costume starts to move, can stay exactly as it is. I think it's really good up to that point. I personally think that there being some sort of like creepy, murderous hermit living in Mowgli's palace could be incredibly unnerving instead of like leaning on the supernatural side of things. I would have our antagonist be creeping around the place and have that be the cause of some of the strange sounds that our narrator hears, kind of like a Doug Ratman character. Since we know that someone died inside of a Donald Duck costume, I think it could be pretty freaky to have a creepy killer maybe like forcing people to wear suits and keeping them captive. Imagine that our killer like knocks out the narrator and puts him in a Goofy costume or something, and then puts on his own Mickey Mouse costume and starts to like play around with him or act out scenes with him. Then instead of a photo negative Mickey Mouse that seems to maybe be a living being full of yellow blood, we just have a crazy guy who is weirdly obsessed with Disney characters. And I think that concept of like Disney adult obsession can actually be done really well and can be pretty creepy. Like if you guys have seen Meat Canyon has a cartoon with Melvin where they're flying to Disney World and they start like changing each other into these weird like flushy Disney characters. It's really creepy and gross, but also kind of funny. And I've talked about it before, but like freaky obsession in any sort of like horror book always creeps me out a lot. I don't know why, but it's one of the reasons that I think House of Leaves is so creepy. And I'm not saying that like my version of the story that I suggested is perfect, but I think it would work a little bit better than like this Resident Evil style ending that we get. Like I said though, I have not read the rest of the series. So I do think that Abandoned by Disney is one of the better creepypastas, and I'm willing to say that it's one of the better pieces of internet horror that I've read. But that comes with a big asterisk. I've wanted to talk about this topic for a while, but I've always been scared of coming off as like kind of pretentious. So just know that I do not mean to sound like I think I'm better than anyone else. But I have to talk about the standard of quality in internet horror as opposed to horror literature. If you only watch this channel for my creepypasta videos, then you might not know that pretty much half of the videos that I make on this channel are about horror novels. I personally love horror literature, and I am incredibly lucky to be in a position where I have a lot of time to read, and that reading lends itself to what is now my full-time job. And having a channel where I alternate between making videos on internet horror and horror literature has made me realize how much more I enjoy horror literature. Also, I apologize for saying literature for like a billion times in the last minute. I need to up my script writing game apparently. I also want to make it clear that I'm aware that internet horror is almost always completely free to read, so I understand that directly comparing the two isn't exactly fair, but I really can't keep myself from comparing them on a subconscious level. Even internet stories that I think are good, like Baraska, or stories that I think are really good, like Pen Pal, don't stand up particularly well to most horror novels that I've read. Horror novels typically have a lot more time and thought put into them. They typically go through multiple revisions and are looked over by editors and publishers before they release. And those things are super important because they make a story better, and internet horror rarely gets that much time dedicated to it, and it starts to show after a while. Now, if you're someone who loves internet horror but doesn't read horror literature, then you've got a wonderful, amazing world of stories by countless authors that you can start exploring. I used to like only read internet horror, and I really didn't pick up a horror book until college, and I had been reading horror for like years up to that point. And I'm so glad that I started reading horror novels because they show me that a story can be so much more than it scares. They can be surprisingly emotional and impactful. There are horror novels that have absolutely terrified me one chapter and then made me cry a few chapters later. That is incredibly impressive to me and should be commended every single time it happens. I made a video on My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, and I had to record a line like 5 times because I was tearing up just talking about what happens in a story. That's insane to me. And the cool thing is that a lot of these newer horror authors were directly inspired by old creepypastas. We Used to Live Here is literally adapted from a No Sleep story. So if you are someone who only reads internet horror and has a hard time getting into a novel, go to the Horror Lit subreddit and ask for some suggestions based on the stories that you personally enjoy. I think that reading a novel is just one of the best things that you can do for yourself. We live in a world where our attention is constantly being demanded from like a dozen different things at all times. So sitting down and engaging with a single person's vision and creation and passion is incredibly refreshing and something we don't get to do often. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's easy to get back into reading novels if you haven't for years. It's not, but I promise that you can do it. You might have gathered this already from the way that I talk and the way that I hyperfixate on things and the general disorganized nature of my scripts, but I have ADHD. And after not reading for fun for years, it was really difficult to build up the reading stamina that I used to have. It took me months for me to be able to just sit down and focus. I used to have to let myself look at my phone between every single page that I read, but then that eventually turned into looking at my phone between each chapter, and now I really don't care about my phone at all when I'm reading. I think that sometimes we very quickly go to the mindset that reading just isn't for me. We think that because we don't read as much as we did like back in the 3rd grade, we must have just like lost that skill or that enjoyment. But that's not true at all. It might be true for you right now, but I promise that you can build up those reading skills that you used to have and become a good reader again that enjoys reading. If you feel ashamed about how short your attention span has become, like I did, don't. Our society has been actively demolishing attention spans for decades now, so it's totally normal to struggle with that. Our English classes went from having students read entire novels to focusing only on short excerpts. Our phones started delivering us shorter and shorter content, and all of this has made people way less capable of just sitting down and reading a book. But I can say that from personal experience, that fighting against this has felt so good to me. It feels really good to just sit down and look at every screen in my house, and my Xbox and my Switch, and then pull out a freaking novel and say, screw you guys, I'm doing this instead. If you have a hard time committing to a novel, which I know is an issue that a lot of people have, then I would really suggest getting a collection of short stories. I personally just read Dark Tales by Shirley Jackson, and those stories were all awesome. I also read an anthology collection called Found that I found to be very similar to a lot of internet horror, but just elevated a little bit. it. Stephen King has a collection of short stories called Night Shift that I absolutely loved reading, and none of those stories were too long, and they also all felt very unique. And since I'm like begging you guys to read horror literature, I will link a whole bunch of my favorite short stories by established authors in the description of this video. I would love for you guys to just try reading one of these stories. All the links will be pages that have them all for free. And if you have any questions about a story that you read, if you don't know what it's trying to say, if you don't understand the ending or anything, you can leave that in the comments of this video, and I will do my best to answer every single question I see down there. Because I really do think that a lot of you internet horror lovers will really grow to love a lot more horror literature if you just give it a chance and try to find something that you like I did. Also, when I'm referring to reading a novel, I'm also counting listening to an audiobook. I personally don't listen to audiobooks because I prefer like having a physical novel in my hand, but audiobooks are great. But anyway, that's just my rant trying to get people who don't really read a lot of horror novels to try to read more, because I personally didn't read a lot of horror. I didn't read a lot of books for years. And then when I started redoing that, I realized how much I enjoy it and how many wonderful stories there are out there just to enjoy. And I think that's really awesome. But back to the question that I posed at the start of this video. Is Abandoned by Disney the best creepypasta? No, at least to me, it's not. I personally prefer Pen Pal and even like shorter stories like Candle Cove. I do think that Abandoned by Disney is definitely better than a lot of creepypasta from that era, but I don't think it's aged particularly well. I wanted to make this video because I got a couple comments, and unless I'm mistaken, I think that Postra may have said that this is one of the best creepypastas. I don't think I've ever watched a Postra video before, and I think the only thing I know about them is that Urban Spook like threw a temper tantrum on Twitter when his series was criticized by them. I think that was the person he got mad at. And if it was Postra that said that about Urban Spook, then I totally respect that as somebody else who kind of critiques a lot of media that I think isn't super great. And also, I know that Postra made a rewrite of Jeff the Killer, because I've probably gotten like 500 comments on my Jeff the Killer video telling me to read the rewrite of that story that they did. So maybe I'll check out Postra's video on this story and see what they liked so much about it, if they ever did make a video about it, and I'm not like completely mistaken about that. If there are more parts to Abandoned by Disney, then I'd love to check them out and revisit this series in a video later, where I maybe go over all the rest of the story in one video. That way I could spend less time talking specifically about like the actual writing of each story, and more just summarize them and give my thoughts, so that video doesn't end up being like 5 hours long. But I think that's going to do it for this little analysis of Abandoned by Disney. Please let me know what you guys think of this story in the comments down below. Also, again, I will be linking some great short stories in the description of this video, so please read one or a couple of them and tell me what you thought in the comments. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, then please do. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers by the end of 2025, which would be absolutely wild. I also, again, started a Let's Play channel with my good friend Zach that'll be in the description of this video, and we would love it if you check that out and subscribed over there. We're trying to hit 500 subs within like the next few weeks, like by the end of July, hopefully. If you want to support me further, then consider becoming a channel member. For just $3 a month, you'll get access to my Discord, members only videos, early access to all my videos, and access to my members only book club. You'll also get your name in the credits of all my videos like you're seeing right now on the screen. A massive thank you to all my gold tier members: Amanda Mapes, Lucas Fernando, Chris Lamb, Ezra, Silent Trails, Blue Radio Media, Tyra the Leper, Vix Corner, Mishjoy16, Coco Boko, Cherry Shark, Moonson Vlog, Starlight Pink, Jack Zamora, Amanda Castillon, Lexi, Arcade Link Author, Pyrocat B, The Official Gar, YBAP Flow, High, Zapodapos, Semra, Laura Gonza, Floropause, Rafael Sampia, Classic Pats Games Plus, Miranda M, Lemonade Slug, Heater Bryant, Ben Best, Mary Elizabeth, and XNM, Sumstar, Digital Fox 615, Issa, Uton, Sherbert, Amelia Nomura, Temple, Ellie, Jupiter Rainstorms, Gambit, Junie, Leah, Maddie, Ellis Hale, Silent Trails, again, so I put you on there twice, Silent Trails, DG Plasm, Vesper, Jess, Miley Bop, and Abigail Wagner. Thank you guys so much for your continued support of the channel. It takes a lot of work to make these videos, and I'm currently a one-man operation, but your support makes it all possible for me to like dedicate most of my waking hours to making content for you guys. And now it is time for the Davis Morgan lore segment of this video, or Davis Lorgan, as a commenter pointed out to me. Today I'm going to be telling you about one of the most embarrassing moments of my life, and I still cringe to this day thinking about it. It probably won't sound that bad to you guys, but I was absolutely mortified when it happened, and I still lay awake at night and wish I could have done things differently, like in any way possible. So despite the fact that I now essentially talk for a living, I'm pretty dang shy in real life, and I was way more shy when I was a kid, especially in elementary school. I was kind of known for being one of the quiet kids in class, but it never really bothered me because I always had a couple friends around me, so I didn't think I was like missing out on that much. But when I started middle school, I was determined to make a change to my personality. You see, my older brothers were generally more outgoing than I was in school. So I knew that I had that potential in me, and I decided that it was finally time to tap into this latent social butterfly-like quality that ran through my veins. And so, after having spent years in the chrysalis of shyness, I decided to force my way out and complete my fated transformation into this social butterfly that I aspired to be. And I knew that I had to commit to this change from the first day of middle school. You see, most of the kids in my elementary school went to Cascade Middle School, but I went to Pacific Middle School. So I knew that most of the people that could call me out for this sudden change in behavior were out of the picture, and any of those that remained, I would crush beneath my heel. And as the day began, I went from class to class, meeting this new group of students that would not know me as the shy Davis Morgan, but rather the life of the party, Social Dave. And I just knew that I was going to pull this off, but it turns out that completely overhauling your personality over the course of a single day is actually kind of difficult. Especially when you spend most of that day going over 6 different syllabi, 1 for each class, and nobody is really even talking besides the teacher. So I stayed silent like a social assassin, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Maybe I wouldn't be able to complete the transformation into Social Dave in one day after all. But that wouldn't matter as long as I remained a relatively unknown figure to those around me. If they couldn't define me, then I could avoid being labeled as a quiet kid. But then everything changed when I went to 5th period PE. I remember it like it was yesterday. My teacher, a buff Canadian dude who used to be a semi-pro ice hockey player, had to sit on the bleachers while he took the attendance. The task was simple. He called your name, and you said, "Here." I had done it 1,000 times before, and I suppose that the monotony of the task was my undoing. As he moved down the list, further down the alphabet, he eventually read out my name. Having been present for thousands of attendance calls, I settled into routine. I said, "Here," very quietly, like a little mouse, like shy Davis Morgan. I hadn't realized that while Social Dave waited to unveil himself like a shinobi waiting for the perfect kill, shy Davis would reveal himself for all the world to see. But this would have been fine. Lots of people aren't super loud when they say "here." The issue was that I was sitting near the back of the bleachers and the teacher didn't hear me. He called out for me again. My heart started to beat faster. I spoke up a little louder, unable to fully break through this cocoon of quiet I had spent years building. I said, "Here," again. This time, the teacher heard me, and I was in the clear. A minor slip-up, but Social Dave was still there, still waiting for the perfect moment, and then the ground fell out from underneath him. My teacher said, in front of everyone, "Huh. You must be one of the quiet ones." My mind was racing. I could feel Social Dave withering away like Hercules when he dives into that pool that turns you into an old man or something. I haven't seen that movie in a while. And while I should have waited for Social Dave to make a calculated decision, my primal instincts took over and I did the only thing I thought I could do to not be labeled as quiet. I yelled, "No, I'm not!" I might as well have just killed Social Dave with my bare hands. Everyone turned around and looked at me. I didn't even yell the entire thing. I started talking at a normal volume and then just got louder and louder as I held the "not" like I was revving the world's most pathetic engine. My face went red. No one said a word. No one even laughed at me. I wish they did. That would have been less embarrassing. And Social Dave was dead from that point on. He kind of made a resurgence in college, but I was back to being a shy kid for years after that embarrassing encounter. But honestly, I've always had a good group of friends, so it really wasn't that bad after all. I was super lucky that I went to school with some pretty awesome people, and some of them are still my best friends to this day, Zach being one of them. But anyways, that's it for the Davis Morgan lore segment. Kind of a longer segment this time, but I thought it'd be fun to write it in a more dramatic fashion than I normally do. Thank you so much for watching this video and supporting the stuff that I do here on this channel, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.